Hey, Peter, thanks for being back on Lever Time.
Hey, David, thanks for having me.
So we reported at the Lever that it would have cost the railroad companies about $321 million to give their workers about 7 paid sick days. Even though the main railroad companies raked in more than $7 billion in profits and paid out over $1.8 billion in dividends, they have been opposing this. And the reason I bring that up is because they obviously have the cash to provide paid sick days to their employees, but they don't want to. And it feels like it's something, it's about something more than just the money. Why are the rail companies digging in so hard against giving their workers 7 paid sick days?
Well, there's a couple things to understand. First of all, from the beginning of railroads in our nation, they have been run more as financial assets, ways to separate cash from unwitting, naive investors, and then rewarding the smart investors, usually oneself if you're an executive, through dividends, and now in our modern age, share buybacks. It's never been about the service. Principally, it certainly hasn't been about being kind to workers. It's always been about finding new workers you could press into service at, back in the old days, just horrific, appalling, deadly conditions. I mean, think about the history of this industry where originally it's mostly Irish Americans who are building the Transcontinental Railroad. They start agitating to not get killed constantly doing this work, to not literally come down with scurvy and other kinds of illnesses. So the railroads go and find Chinese laborers who are even further removed from home, who don't have a sense of legal rights, who don't speak the language, and they exploit them. And, a lot has happened, obviously, in the century plus since then, but certain basic features are the same, which is you're always looking for a way to marginalize working people as cost threats to the bottom line. But then in the meantime, we're in a moment where there's been a lot of attention to this, what I've come to call the great supply chain disruption, where, warehouse workers, dock workers, truck drivers have been agitating for a larger piece of the bounty, given that they have continued to work through this pandemic, often having to choose between their livelihood and their lives. And labor is on the march, and the railroad industry is one that has always been looking out for labor agitation and viewing rail workers as a threat to the bottom line. So it is beyond just this one battle. It's about the balance of power between labor and the executive class.
As it relates specifically to the railroad companies, there is this issue of so-called precision scheduled railroading at the base, at the core of the rail company's business model. Talk to us about what that is and how that intersects with specifically the fight over paid sick days. In other words, why is precision scheduled railroading such an important thing to understand in order to understand why the railroad companies are so opposed to giving their workers more paid sick days?
Well, precision scheduled railroading, which is this wonderful corporate argot, cooked up in some consulting shop, it doesn't actually mean precisely scheduling the railroads. In fact, it means the opposite. It means running the trains whenever you feel like it, whenever's best for the bottom line, which means all the workers just have to deal with the fact that their schedules are more unpredictable than ever. If you're on a maintenance gang and you roam around the country going to wherever you're needed at any given moment, if you're an engineer and you drive the trains, you now are effectively on call all the time. You're constantly being told, sorry that you drove 13 hours from home to get here and you were hoping to go home in 4 days to go spend a day and a half with your family before you go out to your next job site. Well, now you're spending half a day, and that's just how it is. And if you don't like it, we're going to write you up for disciplinary proceedings. Well, that's precision scheduled railroading. It is the latest way in which the railroad executives have sought to lavish the bounty on the shareholders. So How do they do that? Well, they limit scheduling, they drop less profitable routes, and they cut paychecks. And in the 3 or 4 years before the pandemic, they laid off the 7 largest American railroads, roughly a third of the workforce, as a way to free up cash to give to the shareholder via dividends and buybacks. And, they're always trying to deliver whatever metric Wall Street feels like buying. And one of them is so-called operating ratio, which is, the percentage of the revenues that go into operating the railroad. So the better you do at dropping the overhead costs, the better you do boosting operating ratio. So they don't want to add more people, and yet they want to move freight when it's profitable. And that puts a lot of pressure on workers. It makes it harder for workers to even get unpaid leave to go see a doctor, to be home when a child is sick, when a relative is having surgery, when somebody dies, when somebody's born. It's harder and harder for these guys to get paid, unpaid time off. And so this paid sick leave debate just became resonant of the whole deal that railroad workers accept in doing this for a living. It's both an incredibly important issue and a very symbolic one at the same time.
Yeah, and I feel like at the core here that the railroad companies were willing to increase workers' pay by a certain amount because that's they don't want to, but that's something they can kind of cut a check for, as opposed to allowing for more paid sick leave potentially forces the rail companies to reimagine their entire business model. It seems like if they've built their whole business on so-called precision scheduled railroading, which is just, as you said, and alluded to, a kind of a nice corporate term for basically wildly understaffing things, it seems to me that if they have to agree to more paid sick days, that threatens the larger structure of how they envision how their entire business works. And so they've drawn a line in the sand specifically on that because, hey, listen, we may be able to raise your wages here and there. We may be able to raise your benefits here and there. But wait a minute. Paid sick days forces us to rethink the entire formula for how we do business. Is that a fair way to look at it?
I think it is, because precision scheduled railroading is, I think, appropriately likened to just-in-time manufacturing, which was this notion cooked up by Toyota back at the end of the Second World War, which was a sensible idea. Look for ways to do things more efficiently. Don't just make as many cars as possible and sell them, make cars according to the demand. And then consulting companies like McKinsey got involved and turned it into this kind of crude imperative to just slash inventory because that was a way to boost the metric that they were looking for, which was return on assets. If you've got less inventory on your books, then you've got fewer assets to divide into your revenue. Therefore, your return on assets goes up. And precision scheduled railroading is doing something similar. And it requires that you can immediately deploy people however you like, because you've cut people to the absolute minimum so that you're squeezing, the greatest operating ratio out of your railroad as you can. And it's already, even before we had this strike threat and these negotiations, this was already a source of just incredible anger, resentment, anxiety amongst the workforce. I talked to a guy in Tennessee who worked for Norfolk Southern, which is one of the 7 largest railroads. And this is a guy who quit actually in disgust this past summer when he heard his employer talk about record revenues as they're saying they can't afford paid sick leave. He related a story to me where his son was born with a heart defect. Last year, needed surgery as he 8 months old. He couldn't get unpaid leave to stay home to be with his son without pressure. He said his supervisor said, "You really put me in a tough spot. I don't have enough people. I really need you here." That's the level at which we've pushed things. So I do think, you can go even broader with that. I think the railroads simply don't want to give up control. And if you pay out paid sick leave, it's not just the dollars. It's a recognition that, oh, these are human beings. This is not machinery. These aren't robots. These are people. They have families. People get sick. They die. They get tired. Stuff happens. We don't want to deal with that. We want a closed loop where we can deploy people as easily as we can deploy locomotives, and any threat to that system is a threat to a very successful bottom line.
Just to echo your point, the recent federal report about this dispute noted specifically, quote, this is a quote from the federal report, "The rail companies maintain that capital investment and risk are the reasons for their profits, not any contributions by labor." Point being is that the rail companies, to your point about the rail companies and control and what they're willing to acknowledge and not acknowledge, they don't want to acknowledge the overall contribution of their workforce. They effectively don't want to acknowledge, much less give up control of their business operations in a way that would acknowledge that their workers are participating in creating that value. Now, I want to ask a macroeconomic question about what happened when it comes to the potential for these workers to strike. What we saw last week was the Biden administration and the Congress intervening to block a strike and impose the railroad companies' agreement with no more than 1 day of paid sick days on the workers. And the argument for doing that had been, we have to do something or it will crush the economy. So the macroeconomic question is, let's say a strike happened a day, a week, 2 weeks. How crushing would it be to the economy? We'll get to whether they should have intervened or not in a second, but just the macroeconomic picture of what would happen if there was a strike.
Oh, I think the stakes were very high. I mean, rail moves roughly 40% of all the freight through the United States. And if you shut down the rail system, that's a lot of stuff that can't move. I mean, there were credible reports that we wouldn't have enough chlorine and other chemicals for wastewater treatment plants, all sorts of plants that make all sorts of things and require chemicals to make paints, industrial solvents. They've been potentially facing shortages as we've looked at a potential halt to rail. And of course, trucking would pick up the extra slack. Well, trucking doesn't have extra slack because thanks to deregulation started by Jimmy Carter in the late 70s, trucking has gone from an always tough but decent job, a decent way to support a family at a middle class standard, to something that no person would ever do if they had some alternative. So we've got these quote unquote shortages of truck drivers, which really means we've run out of people willing to take the deal that is driving a truck in America in 2022. So, we'd have shortages there too. We'd have cargo rates go up at a time when everybody's worried about inflation. We would potentially have more of it and more shortages. That threat was very real.
Then let's turn to whether or not Congress should have intervened. I'm not going to ask you to weigh in on where you come down on that. I want to ask the question about leverage, about who had bargaining power here. And seems to me the Democrats in Congress, Joe Biden as president, could have chosen to say to the railroad companies, you got two choices. We can either the government can impose the agreement with 7 paid sick days that Joe Biden has, by the way, promised to all workers when he ran for president. You can either have that or the Congress is not going to intervene. And it seems to me that this was a situation where the Democrats had all the leverage because by doing nothing, they could have at least helped the workers or at least forced the railroad companies back to the negotiating table. I guess my question on this is, how much did the railroad companies need Biden and the Congress to intervene versus how much did the workers need the Congress to intervene? It seems to me it was the rail guys, the railroad companies that needed the intervention far more than the workers. In other words, the Democrats could have just said, listen, the way we're going to help workers at minimum is just not do anything.
Well, I think the best way to answer that question is to go back in time. How did we end up with this system where the Railway Labor Act restricts the ability of workers to strike? It goes all the way back to the late 19th century when there was tremendous social unrest targeting the people we now call the robber barons, the monopolists who got outsized shares of American rail. The center of the action in 1877 was in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Railroad was by far the most important industrial rail system. It connected the ports of the East Coast to what was then the frontier, to agricultural lands, to the Midwest, and the beginnings of industry. And when workers said, you know what, we don't like the deal we're getting, we're going on strike, there were violent wildcat actions. The result of this was that the head of the Pennsylvania Railroad managed to persuade the then governor of Pennsylvania to send in militia from the other side of the state in Philadelphia. And they actually opened fire and killed, depending upon who you ask. Certainly scores of people died, many of them just bystanders, including children who were just looking on from a hillside. We got we got strikes basically across much of the industrial part of the country throughout that year. And out of that came what we now call the Railway Labor Act, which is this piece of legislation that says, sorry, guys, you guys are special. In other industries, if workers don't like the deal, they can do the ultimate. They can withhold their labor till they're willing to accept the bargain. Not you guys. You guys are so vital, and there's no other way to move freight. So for you to strike, you have to exhaust this convoluted process of bargaining sessions, declarations of impasse, presidential broker, this presidential emergency board that tries to mediate, and, on it goes. Clearly, this was about minimizing the leverage that labor enjoys, and to make it harder for labor to damage the economy by withholding its labor. So, yes, there is no question that when Congress intervenes to impose a settlement, it is doing the bidding of the railroads.
And I think that needs to be underscored over and over again, because a lot of the discourse has been, look, the Republicans voted against, for instance, the paid sick leave provisions in the ultimate deal. And I keep going back to the idea that it's the Democratic Congress. It's not to, by the way, absolve the Republicans, but it is the Democratic Congress that is writing the legislation and scheduling the votes on a bill to impose an agreement with only one paid sick days, an inadequate agreement to say the least. And that is what the railroad companies needed. That is not what the workers needed. And so when you hear people blaming the Republicans, I'm like, look, the Republicans aren't the good guys here, but the Democrats used their power to intervene on behalf of the railroad companies, and they did not have to do that. If they would have stayed out, that would have at least boosted the power of the workers. So I guess the final question then is, now that this agreement has been imposed through the force of law by the Democratic Congress and the Democratic president, what options are left to the railroad unions, the railroad workers? Is there a likelihood of wildcat strikes, or does this just go away now? Just these workers who are so vital to the economy, they just don't get more than one day of paid sick leave?
I don't think it goes away. I mean, I think out of the pandemic, if we didn't know it already, we've had a lot of experiences where we've seen that normalcy in our economy depends upon huge numbers of people working in conditions that most of us would not accept for ourselves or our families. Conditions where you do have to choose between your paycheck and your health. You don't get a say over where you work and when, or how much protection you've got. You're just deemed essential, and off you go. You accept the bargain that's on the table for you. And there has been this awakening. Now, it's hard to say where this goes and how much staying power it's got, but clearly the labor movement writ large has momentum that it didn't have before the pandemic, and the politics have changed. One imagines that this rail strike we'll continue a conversation about paid sick leave at the federal level, because the U.S. is an outlier among all wealthy nations. I mean, if you go tell your European or Australian friends that, you live in a country that doesn't have any paid sick leave at all, it's like explaining, the gun stuff. Like they just can't believe it, right? They can't process it. So presumably there will be some sort of push, but it's also true that there are a lot of powerful corporate interests that very diligently give to both sides of the aisle that don't, same as it ever was, don't want to take money away from the shareholder to give it to workers. And that basic balance is what we're always talking about.
Peter Goodman is a global economics correspondent for the New York Times. He's also the author of the must-read book, I really mean it, a must-read book called Davos Man: How the Billionaires Devoured the World. You can find him on Twitter at Peter S. Goodman. Peter, thanks as always.
Thank you so much.